Hey class, recording my last session here. Sorry, it's not the last for you, but it's the last one I'm recording. I'm not necessarily recording all these in order. Um, so today we are going to look, most of our focus has been on the federal level, and today we're going to look a lot more at some state and a little bit on local, but mostly state level environmental policies and how that is different often from federal policymaking. So again, and we've talked about federalism before, but federalism is this balance of power between state and the federal government. And that's because we live in a democratic system that splits power between these two sort of quasi-sovereign entities, the national federal government and state governments that have overlapping powers on a variety of issues. And federalism is sort of the dynamic tension between how that plays out. And environmental policy, we see a lot of dynamic federalism working back and forth on environmental policy making. So there's a balance of state and federal laws. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution states that any powers not specifically delegated to the federal government belong to the states. These are called reserved powers. That means that the state, by default, has power over stuff unless the Constitution specifically grants that authority to the federal government. If the Constitution does grant that authority to the federal government, then the federal government has the ultimate say, the ultimate authority over that. Um, the expressed powers, those are powers that the Constitution does grant to the federal government. It's things like declare war, print money, interstate commerce. And again, remember, interstate commerce is the constitutional justification for most environmental policy making at the federal level. Anything else falls under the category of reserved power, things that are reserved for the state, commerce within the state, issuing licenses, policing, etc. Concurrent powers would be powers that are exist on both levels, raising taxes, for example, and many other forms of environmental policy also. Supremacy clause says that the federal authority preempts state authority, but in some cases, this is referred to as a conditional preemption. In some matters, the federal government has authority to take desired action directly, depending upon what it is. As an example, the Clean Air Act gives states um, under the Clean Air Act, states regulate permitting for new sources, but the federal government can intervene. For example, if the federal EPA thinks that states are not that state plans do not fit within the federal Clean Air Act laws and regulations and existing federal regulations, then the EPA can intervene. Otherwise, states regulate the permitting process. One of the most famous quotes on this topic comes from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis from the 1930s, and Justice Brandeis referred to this this issue of federalism and the role of states in policymaking as, quote, laboratories of democracy. A single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the entire country. Think scientific method here. States can experiment with new ideas, with novel ideas. And this laboratories of democracy idea has guided a lot of the justification, the political justification um, around policymaking on all topics. This idea that states can experiment. And we've seen this in environmental policymaking in many, many ways, and we're going to review a lot of those here in this lecture of ways that states have experimented, in many cases going beyond what the federal government does, or stepping into the gap when the federal government is not taking action, which of course we talked a lot about the federal government not taking action. It's provide a lot of opportunity for states to step into that gap. And a lot of research really points toward states being much better at developing novel ideas and in terms of decision making, critical decision making around some forms of policy. State purview of environmental laws, a lot of environmental enforcement happens at the state level. And we talked about a lot of the policy making happens at the federal level, but the enforcement happens at the state level. And many issues are also primarily state matters, particularly things like waste management, groundwater protection, land use, transportation, energy production. All of these things are primarily overseen at the state level. Now, of course, we do have a lot of federal laws governing these kinds of things. And we've talked about a lot of this already, energy policies and water related policies and air policies. But the enforcement of that and the way that those are managed happen at the state level. Now, as we talked about, the EPA, the federal EPA, can step in if state uh, management policies are not up to federal code, up to what the federal government requires. However, most of the times, this enforcement, the management of these kinds of issues, particularly these more localized issues like waste management, is a great example. A lot of that lies with the states and local municipalities. Oops, sorry. And notably, some states have stepped forward in absence of federal regulation. So we have no federal regulation around e-waste, for example, electronic waste, or fracking, hydraulic fracturing. There's very little federal guidance around this at all. And so some states have stepped forward, and we'll look at those examples. And in some areas, states are allowed to go beyond federal environmental policies. Not in every area. Some federal laws specifically prohibit states from going beyond federal policies, but many of them do allow that, particularly around air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. We see the states are allowed to go beyond federal policies, and many states have innovated in these ways. And of course, taxing is one of those concurrent powers. States can tax, federal government can tax. Federal government is doing a poor job of taxing pollution. Many states are doing better at that and have examples of how that can be used effectively to address environmental policy concerns. EPA has broad authority to regulate pollution, but enforcement tends to happen at the local level. Now, you take all of this and you add in an increasingly dysfunctional federal government plus the growing professionalism of state agencies, and you're getting a lot more state involvement in policymaking, especially environmental policymaking. Now, your reading points to a few reasons why states are taking a larger role with environmental public policy. Particularly, we talked about, no, we haven't yet. We come up in the next lecture, I think, public support for environmental policymaking. There really is broad public support for environmental policymaking generally. Now, it gets more contentious the more specific you get about that, and particularly once you try to implement actual policies. But in general, there's support for environmental policymaking, pretty broad support among the public. That reality lends itself a little bit more to bottom-up environmental policymaking tailored to local concerns. It's increasingly difficult to do things at the federal level because we're talking about very broad policies that apply to the entire United States. Well, if you're talking state level action, that's a lot easier to accomplish. It's more achievable for states to implement bottom up environmental policymaking because of that broad support and because state level legislatures are not quite as contentious or polarized as national level ones. Now, they still are quite polarized. Nevertheless, state level policymaking is a lot easier. Much more high quality environmental professionals at the state level than there used to be. And that lends itself good to creative problem solving around environmental issues. And a lot of states have what are called direct democracy provisions in place that allows citizens to directly influence policy. For example, ballot initiatives. Many states, including Ohio, where I live, have the ability to get an issue onto the ballot. And you can actually, in Ohio, amend the state constitution by simple majority vote of the public. Now, it's difficult to get it onto the ballot. You have to get a certain percentage of signatures from a certain percentage of states across the state of Ohio. And it's a big lift, but it happens every time. Every time we vote, there's at least one or two statewide ballot initiatives to vote on here. And those direct democracy provisions lend themselves much more to environmental policy making. We've talked so long about how contentious and polarized policymaking is at the federal level, and yet there's still kind of broad support for many environmental policies. And so these direct democracy provisions allow opportunity for citizens to get a stronger say in that kind of policy making and result in some more effective state level policies. So let's look at a number of examples of state level environmental policy making, starting with the issue of electronic waste or e-waste. Now, this is an example of state progress in the absence of federal legislation. There is no federal legislation guiding what to do with e-waste. In other words, this is a great opportunity for those laboratories of democracy to function, for states to experiment by implementing e-waste laws in the absence of any federal regulation. There more than 25 states have laws about what to do with e-waste, and that has provided a lot of opportunity for states to really step into that gap. Now, of course, the limitation here is, well, that's about half of the states that don't have laws around e-waste, and half of the states where a lot of electronic waste is simply going to the landfill instead of being properly recycled, which is why we want federal regulation around a lot of these problems. But in the absence of it, at least we have some states stepping into the gap to help promote laws around that. One particularly promising set of sort of category of laws that especially applies to e-waste, not only to e-waste, we see a lot with plastics too. It's called extended producer responsibility, or abbreviated EPR. And what extended producer responsibility does, it's a policy tool and it shifts the burden of particularly around disposal, of the burden of disposal from the consumer to the producer of that product, shifts responsibility to the producers. So often the way this works is producers are charged a fee when they produce that product. So when you sell that product, they're charged a fee, and that fee is intended to cover the cost of collecting, recycling, and disposing of that product. We see this a lot around electronics, around plastics. We see a lot around tires or battery cores. Like if you ever changed out the battery in your car, when you buy a new battery, there's a core charge, a core fee to that. That core fee is part of this theory of extended producer responsibility, and it helps go to recover the cost of collecting, recycling, disposing of that product. Often, this process is overseen by a nonprofit group with input from stakeholders. Ideally, what it does is it incentivizes sustainable designs in order to avoid those kinds of fees. Now, it doesn't always work. Excuse me. The watch keeps buzzing at me. Oh, mattresses. That's another example that we often see there as well. So extended producer responsibility, this idea that you're shifting the burden to the producer by charging a fee to the producer to cover the cost of processing and recycling and disposing responsibly of that kind of product, which is great because if you think about, if it costs, let's say, and I don't know if this is the case, let's say it costs $10 to responsibly recycle a computer, to take apart its components, disassemble its components, recycle them. There's a lot of really important components in a computer that should be recycled. We have heavy metals in there, we have scrap metal, we have plastics, etc. Very few consumers are willing to pay that to do it themselves, right? But if you have EPR laws in place that are charged to the producer of that product, when that product's sold, that producer pays that fee. That fee is collected by a state agency, by a nonprofit group, by whatever, and then is used at the end of life to help cover the cost of properly recycling those items. So suddenly it's no longer a charge to recycle it, it's free to recycle it. Well, it actually costs someone something, but that cost is being included when you have an EPR law in place, that cost is being included at the manufacturer side of that. So that can be a very effective way to help sort of redesign towards more zero waste kind of thinking, towards circular economy kind of thinking, towards ways of making it so that the consumer isn't as burdened with recycling, whereas more of that burden relies on the producer of it. And design really matters in terms of, if you think about an e-waste program, how you design it matters. Convenience mandates, for example, can require broad distribution of collection sites. This idea is that you wanted to make it as convenient as possible. If you have to drive a half hour away to find a place to dispose of your e-waste, that's not going to work. Not many people are going to do that. And honestly, the pollution generated from driving that far makes it perhaps arguably not worth it. But convenience mandates, some states have laws in the books requiring certain types of retail establishments to establish collection sites for e-waste. And you often that's why you often see those at like a Staples, for example, e-waste collection sites. Most Staples will collect e-waste there. Or performance mandates, collection requirements based on a percentage of weight. So we see these kinds of mandates can really matter in terms of encouraging collection and avoiding some of the added problems of e-waste processing. Another example, in the absence of federal legislation, so we have no federal legislation around hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Colorado, for example, has a long history in oil and gas. They've long been an oil and gas producer, but Colorado is also very environmentally minded. So Colorado has really led the way in terms of state level regulations around oil and gas development, and particularly requiring public disclosure of chemicals. So the fracking industry likes to keep secret the chemicals they use in fracking. The fracking process includes a tremendous amount of water that is piped underground at high pressure to burst open to fracture. Hydraulic being water, fracturing to fracture the shale in order to allow the oil and gas to flow back out. Well, it's not just water that they're piping under there, it's water with a bunch of chemicals to help open up that shale. And the fracking companies don't like to talk about what those are because of proprietary reasons. But Colorado requires fracking companies to disclose the chemicals that are being used. They also require water quality sampling, regular water quality sampling, because this hydraulic fracturing process goes through underground reservoirs. There's strong methane emission standards in Colorado. Methane, of course, is a byproduct. Well, natural gas effectively is methane, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 30 times stronger than CO2. So any methane leakage leads to significant amount of increase in global warming. So strong methane emission standards really important. And Colorado also allows extensive local regulatory oversight. They allow local municipalities to set their own rules that are more, of course, they can't set them less stringent than the state, but they can be more stringent than that. And that is really important for empowering local communities to make their own decisions around environmental protection. Ohio, on the other hand, where I live, has a law prohibiting local communities from setting their own rules around fracking. We have a lot of fracking in Ohio, and no local municipalities are allowed to make any rules around that, which doesn't seem very democratic to me. Um, the state of New York actually has a complete ban on fracking and has since 2014, starting with an executive order at the state level and then following up with a statute at the state level in 2021, setting a permanent ban on fracking in the state of New York. There's also examples of going beyond the federal government. So not so much a lack of federal government involvement, but going beyond that. One example is toxic pollution in Minnesota. So Minnesota has passed what's called a Toxic Pollution Prevention Act. And what that does, so companies that report to the Toxic Release Inventory, the TRI tool, that, and shoot, have we talked about that? We did talk about that briefly in the EPA lecture in here. So the TRI tool shows, again, it maps where all of the toxic waste are located around the country and has very strict requirements on reporting what kinds of toxic waste it is, how it's being maintained, etc. So companies that report to the TRI, they have to submit toxic waste pollution prevention plans with reduction goals on them. So Minnesota requires you go beyond what the EPA is requiring to say, hey, if you have to report to the TRI, you also have to submit to the state of Minnesota your pollution prevention plan and your reduction goals for how you're going to reduce that. So that gives the Minnesota EPA the opportunity to oversee that. There are specific fees associated with toxic pollution, this idea of discouraging that, not just from requiring companies to report it, which is a really valuable step, but actually taxing that so that there is an incentive for companies to avoid, to minimize as much as possible toxic pollution. There's state reduction timetables in terms of reducing pollutants and flexibility in how to implement it. So traditional federal regulations have no flexibility in them. They usually are command and control approach. It forces you to adopt a certain technology. Minnesota has a more flexible way to do that in terms of how you implement it, and that allows companies to find whatever way works best that actually results in a reduction of toxic pollution. And of course, they know that because companies are reporting to the TRI, but they're also submitting their prevention plans and reduction goals to the state of Minnesota. So Minnesota is able to monitor that. They're also one of the first states to ban BPA and to address PFAS, those forever chemicals that stay around forever. So pollution has, sorry, Minnesota has done a great job of going beyond the federal government in terms of toxic waste prevention. Another example of going beyond the federal government, we talked about this a little bit, relates to California's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So this goes back to prior to the Clean Air Act. California's Air Resources Board, CARB, is what it's called. They were began setting air quality standards before the Clean Air Act was ever passed on the federal level. So because CARB was already regulating air quality standards, and because California had many problems with air quality, when the Clean Air Act was passed, um, the Clean Air Act normally prevents states from setting their own emission standards for vehicles. The Clean Air Act specifically says states can't set their own. There's one federal rule, but however, it made an exception for California, a loophole, because California had significant air quality problems and had already been involved in regulating air pollution from motor vehicles in the state. So the Clean Air Act grants what's called a waiver of preemption for the state of California, that California can set their own more rigorous standards compared to other states. The EPA, in fact, is required to grant the waiver unless, and it gives three reasons why the EPA could make an exception, why the EPA could deny California's waiver. First, if California standards are not as strict as federal standards, that's never the case. Second, the air quality in California doesn't compel more stringent standards. And third, if the California standards are inconsistent with the requirements of the Clean Air Act related to technical feasibility and lead time for auto manufacturers. This has become problematic in recent years because the Trump administration, in his first administration and then again in the second administration, repealed the waiver. So California had a waiver a waiver of preemption to set their own motor vehicle emission standards. Trump repealed that. That was quite dubious legally to do. Biden reinstated that. Trump has since again repealed that. It's still fairly dubious on whether the EPA can do that. Again, remember the Clean Air Act only gives three specific reasons why the EPA can deny a waiver. And it doesn't necessarily state that the EPA has the power to repeal a waiver. So this tends to get caught up in court when this happens. Nevertheless, California normally has that authority to do that. Historically, has been able to do that to set their own motor vehicle emission standards. As a result, this has really pushed the rest of the country and pushed automakers to set more stringent standards because California, the most populous state in the US, the largest economy in the US, on its own, it's like the fifth largest economy in the world. If you're a Detroit automaker, you want to make sure that your cars are going to be able to be sold in California. And so this has pressured automakers to be even more rigorous in their emission standards than the federal government. It also this preemption allows other states to adopt California's more rigorous standards. And that's exactly what 17 states have done. They've adopted California's more rigorous standards. Um, oh, yeah. And then 12 states specifically have adopted California's zero emission vehicle standards of having basically all vehicles to be sold after 2035 to be zero emission vehicles. These 17 states combine for about 40% of all vehicles sold in the country. So that, as you can imagine, has a really significant effect overall. Also worth noting, not all state level policies are partisan. These states here, yes, most of these are Democratic states, and certainly California is very left leaning, but not all state level policies are partisan. For example, there was a fascinating movement about 10 years ago called the Green Tea Coalition. And you're probably too young to really remember this, but the Tea Party movement from 10, 12 years ago was a movement by conservatives that were basically fed up with taxes. They didn't like taxes. They really pushed for more fundamentalist, conservative, especially economically conservative leaders to get elected under the premise that we need to reduce taxes. So a very Republican Party, very right-leaning in many ways. However, one of the interesting ways we saw this coalition between the Tea Party and the Green Party, which of course is very left-leaning, very pro-environmental policy, on this issue of solar panels. And the Tea Party, which was very right-wing, sort of had this mentality, this ideology that personal freedoms are the ultimate good sort of in society. And if that's the case, then who is the government to tell me I can't put solar panels on my house? And then I should be able to get the maximum economic benefit of doing that. They saw this as an energy independence issue. So there's this great collaboration between the Sierra Club and the Tea Party in Georgia, again, very right wing, um, to try to change Georgia's laws in order to allow for greater freedom and economic benefit of having rooftop solar in Georgia. And they were ultimately were successful at that. So really interesting collaboration kind of thing. And again, this was framed not around environmental issues, but around energy independence and your ability to take charge of your own energy production instead of the monopolistic energy companies. So really interesting there. Policy through taxation. A lot of states are much more effective at taxing pollution in certain ways in order to promote environmental policy making. In New York, on your utility bill, on your electric bill, they have something called the SBC charge. And basically, that is a small fee added to electric bill that goes to fund energy efficiency programs for low income households. So really advantageous way of getting a whole lot of money out there to help decrease energy use in the state. And it's a fairly low charge. From when I lived in New York, I remember I think it was like usually $1 or $2 on our bills overall. We see this taxation policy through a lot of things. Tires, we already talked about, motor oil, pesticide containers, mattresses, plastic bags. It's part of that extended producer responsibility kind of approach to that. But by taxing things, by adding surcharges on these things, it helps in some ways decrease their use, but also promote responsible recycling when that's relevant. Just like with the federal government, we have state taxes, federal government. The federal gas tax is fixed. Forgive me, I have not looked up. This is okay, 2022. I'm not sure if this has changed since 2022. But different states have different levels of state taxes on gas as well. Unfortunately, as electric vehicle expansion has continued to increase, many states have looked at this and said, "Oh, well, we're getting less taxes coming in because fewer people are buying gas and more people are shifting to electric." So some states have made up for that by adding in a penalty fee when you register your electric vehicle. This is my rude awakening when I moved to Ohio. New York does not have that. When I moved to Ohio, I went to register my all-electric Chevy Bolt. I was surprised with a $200 fee to the state. And the theory behind that is that it's making up for the lack of me paying my gas tax, I suppose. My thought is just increase the gas tax on other people to incentivize them to shift to electric. And then we'll figure out how to make it up after that. Bottle bills. Some of you may live in states, Osable is located in Michigan, even though you're not in Michigan now. But if you were to buy a can of Coke, or as they call it, Michigan Pop, um, from the store down the road from Osable Institute, you would have a 10-cent bottle deposit on that can or on that bottle. What that means is if the bottle costs $1, you're paying $1.10. 10 cents of that goes to the state but as a deposit that you'll get back when you return that bottle to a recycling center. New York had this for 5 cents. Many other states have this as well. This has been extremely effective at encouraging recycling. In fact, Michigan has a 91% recycling rate, which is much higher than most states. Um, and as you can see here, non-deposit states, on average, aluminum cans, 84% recycling compared to just 39% in states without a deposit. Same thing with plastic, PET, or glass. You see these big differences. States with deposit laws have much higher recycling rates. Plastic bag bans, many places around the country and around the world. In fact, many countries have bag bans in place. I believe Kenya was the first one to institute a bag ban. 12 states. Um, my apologies. Hold on one second. More than 500 cities. I was living in New York when New York instituted their plastic bag ban. Everyone complained about it for a week, and then they got in the habit of bringing their reusable bags with them, and no one ever complained about it again. I think it's silly when people complain about that. We already all do it to go to Aldi anyways. Aldi doesn't have disposable plastic bags, so it's easy enough to do that. Mixed reports on results. Effective for reducing the total number of plastic bags, yes. It's a little bit questionable about reducing total plastic content because those reusable plastic bags require a lot more plastic to produce them compared to a disposable plastic bag. So if you use it a lot, that reusable bag, then it works out. If it breaks down too early, then that may not be as good. Um, Question about total environmental footprint. I didn't put a slide up here, but I've looked at this research before around the carbon content of producing disposable plastic bags compared to reusable plastic bags and compared to reusable cotton bags. And um, the disposable plastic bags, because they're so thin and there's so little material there, um, the pollution associated with producing those is much smaller. But of course, they create their own trash that never goes away. The plastic bags take forever to break down, hundreds of years to break down and get out in the environment regularly. What's the best solution? I'm not sure. But some states and some places have tried that. Laboratories of Democracy tried on bag bans. Combined with fees for paper bags, it can be effective. Uh, so that's one effort. Another example of local integration with environmental policies, the state of Texas actually requires all schools to develop what's called a pest management plan, integrated pest management plan. These IPMs, basically what they do is they are an attempt to reduce fertilizer and pesticide use on school grounds, and they're considered a best practice in environmental sustainability, IPM plans. And Texas requires all schools to do that, to submit IPM plans to the state. Another great example of how a state, and in this case, a conservative state, can really lead the way on some environmental issues. We talked about RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, before, but let's dig into that a little bit more. What this is, so this is a cooperative, market-based, state-level approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, it's a coalition of states up in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic area of the U.S., and it's an attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by trading. It's a cap and trade style program. So the way it works, participating states set a limit on carbon emissions from things like factories and power plants. Facilities that emit carbon dioxide must buy allowances that equal their emissions. So this is pricing it. Going back to our market discussion, they're pricing the thing that we don't want. That's pollution. That's carbon emissions. That's burning of fossil fuel. So they're pricing that. Facilities now have to buy permits for that. That discourages them from doing it, and it encourages them to shift their sources towards more clean energy. RGGI states sell those allowances and invest that revenue back into things like energy efficiency improvements, clean energy, bill assistance, other programs delivered to communities. And it creates this cycle, this perpetuating cycle, and it has been extremely effective at reducing emissions. They call it a cap and invest program. And this is a collaborative effort between a bunch of different states. The cap also declines annually, forcing emissions lower and lower. So you can't just ride the cap and expect to be fine. The way it works is that the states gradually are decreasing that cap, which is pushing industry and power producing facilities to get cleaner and cleaner energy. Right now, it's what is this, 12 states, I believe. Over $6 billion raised so far. It's added thousands of jobs, almost $6 billion in additional benefits to the region. It's cut emissions by 50%. So this has proven to be an incredibly effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the northeastern US. There's a couple states that are still in limbo. I think in Pennsylvania, it was ruled unconstitutional last year by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So I think that is still kind of up in the legal limbo land. North Carolina was blocked by the state budget bill, so they're kind of blocked right now. But all of the other dark green states, it's been active implementation and has been very effective. Another effort to address greenhouse gas emissions, and I will reference this in my global climate policy talk. But when Trump in his first term pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, we saw this fascinating movement called We Are Still In that was headed up particularly by these two gentlemen, Jerry Brown, then governor of California, Michael Bloomberg, then mayor of New York City. And what they did was they collaborated, working with many others together, and they brought in a whole bunch of states, cities, colleges, religious institutions, businesses to say the Trump administration may say we're out of the Paris Agreement, but we are still in. We're still committed to Paris Agreement goals. So it's another good example of states stepping into the gap. And that was intentional to try to bolster international support for the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement was still young at this point. There was some concern that the US backing out might cause it to fail. So this effort really pushed to say, no, we're still in, we're still committed to reducing emissions. And that really helped the rest of the world stay committed to the Paris Agreement and continuing to pursue that. Altogether, these institutions who are part of the We Are Still In movement represent over 50% of the US economy. So ultimately, it proved from a diplomatic perspective very effective at supporting the Paris Agreement. And this was done from subnational entities. Your book talks about renewable portfolio standards. These are basically state mandates that a certain percentage of your electricity comes from renewables, particularly from solar and wind. Every state policy is different. Every state policy looks different. For example, Texas and Iowa have different generation amounts that are required, not necessarily a percentage of the total production. Some states have voluntary standards of, others are encoded into law and are required of their utilities. It's estimated that around half of the growth in renewable energy since 2000 can be traced to RPS standards. So incredibly important, kind of like RGGI, the RPS standards have been incredibly important at driving the clean energy transition. Justification here, it helps diversify energy sources. It helps promote local production of clean energy. It helps make grids more resilient. By distributing energy production, encourages economic development. They've been adopted in 38 states. 15 of those now have 100% clean energy goals. So really been very effective at that. Now, not all states have persisted with it. And sometimes these renewable portfolio standards really vary significantly in quality from one place to another. For example, in New York, the original RPS was 30% renewable by 2015. And then in 2015, it was increased to 50% renewable by 2030. And then 2019 increased to 100% carbon free by 2040 and net zero carbon by 2050. So New York has had continually more and more ambitious goals around renewable energy development. And having lived in New York, you could visually see that as more and more solar installations kept popping up all over the state and continue to do so. Since 2018, 19 states, such as New York, have increased their RPS targets, making them more ambitious. However, at least 8 states have followed Ohio's example and have uh, drawn back their commitments on that. Originally, Ohio committed to 12.5% renewable by 2026. Um, that was cut to 8.5% in 2019. They eliminated the solar carve out and a variety of other problems as well. Uh, Maybe even worse, in 2023, they passed a law labeling natural gas as green energy, which is just a bunch of baloney. And in fact, changed the state code about oil and gas exploration from state agencies may issue leases to state agencies shall issue leases, making a clear implication that states have to do this, or so the state agencies have to do this. So Ohio really backtracking. Some states have completely allowed their RPS targets to expire altogether. So we see a real, you know, like on the national level, a polarization, a real shifting, a little real imbalance and movement on this, even though renewable energy continues to be broadly popular throughout most of the US. Nevertheless, from a policy perspective, some states have really backtracked on that. New York has really, of course, not surprisingly, led the way in terms of environmental policy, particularly their Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act from 2019 had really, really large goals, 70% greenhouse gas reduction in electricity by 2030, 100% by 2040. We see enormous amounts of offshore wind, of battery storage, of distributed solar, of all of these things with certain target dates by them, and overall greenhouse gas reductions, really ambitious goals as well. Um, Governor Hochul has just recently backtracked, or not backtracked, but delayed some of these dates here by a little bit under the guise of concern about energy prices. Um, Really, if we just hadn't invaded Iran, that would have dealt with the energy price concerns, but nothing Governor Hochul could do about that. Um, so some a little bit delay, even in left-leaning states. Sometimes we see these kinds of delays around implementation of environmental policy standards. Some examples of ballot measures. We talked about direct democracy provisions and some ballot measures from a few years ago. New York had a big one for a variety of environmental issues there, $4.2 billion bond to protect a bunch of things like clean drinking water and air pollution and green infrastructure, et cetera. Cook County, Illinois, that's where Chicago is, had $1 billion local ballot measure passed that over 20 years would expand the forest preserve in the district. Denver, Colorado, $360 million to build sidewalks in disenfranchised parts of the city to try to address transportation concerns, make transportation more viable, make it a more walkable city, for example, which has obvious environmental benefits as well. Unfortunately, some, as your book points out, states seem to be racing to the bottom on state environmental policy. While many states have really been innovative and have passed really key provisions advancing environmental policy, some states seem to be doing the exact opposite. Many times under the guise of economic development strategy, this idea being that they want economic development at all costs, no matter what kind of pollution costs that may mean. But to promote economic, the great expansion of data centers is a great example of that. The data centers, which we haven't talked about extensively in this class, but have significant amounts of pollution and water use and energy use, but they can bring some money into the state. And some states have really leaned into bringing in the data centers to bring in the money, not really strategically thinking about the negative environmental impact that comes with that as well. Some states have passed restrictions on state agencies from implementing more aggressive standards than the EPA. Almost half of states specifically forbid their state level EPA from setting more rigorous standards than the federal EPA. Ohio's definitely in that boat. There's some inconsistencies in reporting accuracy. Many states rely pretty heavily on the federal government subsidies for funding their implementation. Remember, we talked about how states' implementation of environmental policy really sits with the states. And many states have become entirely reliant on federal subsidies for doing that. And so that makes them kind of vulnerable to changes in federal policy and cuts to pollution spending and staffing, just like we've seen recently at the federal level. Sometimes we see that in some state agencies as well. Yeah, and many states have cut funding for state environmental agencies. Some challenges, economic pressures. Forgive me, sometimes I'm reading these, trying to remember what I said. States are far more deeply committed to strategies that promote investment and development than those that promote social services, etc. We talked about that. Getting tired of talking. State level political polarization in legislatures, it's not quite as bad as the federal government. It is still bad. And in the last year or two has definitely gotten worse. Reversals of environmental policies. And there's some inherent challenges to transboundary issues, which air pollution is 100% of the time a transboundary issue. So these kinds of things, there's a real trend of, of lack of concern from one state to another over pollution that drifts into the other state. Just briefly about cities and some opportunities for city level policy making. How about biking infrastructure? Think about the importance that that has in terms of, one of the biggest problems we have in the US is we're such a car dependent society. We're so heavily dependent upon personal vehicle transportation, and that comprises almost 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Well, one of the solutions to that is by expanding biking infrastructure. And many states are doing that, including the ones labeled in green here, which are leading cities in terms of most bikeable cities. The red being the bad ones, the ones that are not bikeable. But local governments can do a lot in terms of expanding biking infrastructure through bike lanes or by including bike share programs that allow, and many campuses are doing this too, adding bike lanes, adding bike share programs on campuses. And that encourages biking rather than driving, which is a policy solution at the local level. Green building codes as well. At least 30 US cities have adopted stricter building energy codes since 2017. Many cities are really focusing in on this as one tool to help promote environmental policies, to help decrease pollution by focusing on building energy codes. In terms of, things like requiring new homes to have electric car chargers installed in the garages, or requiring new homes or preventing new homes from building with natural gas, requiring electric heating, requiring high efficiency heat pumps installation. These are all things that help promote environmental sustainability that have to do with energy codes and building codes. Or zoning with sustainability in mind. If you think, most of American cities are structured where you have massive residential area, and then, up over here you got a retail area, and then way over here you have where everyone drives to work. And so you get these long commutes of people driving long distances. Well, if we rezoned in ways that you had a more mix between retail sites, office sites, different kinds of multifamily apartments, single family homes, and you had these kind of more intentionally designed within kind of the same space, what that does is that really significantly decreases the kinds of pollution you get from transportation, of moving people around. Suddenly you don't have to drive everywhere you go, or if you do, it's not very far to get to that because you have zoned the city accordingly. These are often referred to as mixed use neighborhoods. Here's a concept for what one looks like. We have things like office buildings and retail spaces and apartments all located in close together, along with you add into that some walkability, some pedestrian areas, and suddenly you get a lot less pollution problems in a city, a lot less traffic congestion. And those are things that really sit with cities, making cities more walkable, for example. Some cities have really led the way in terms of purchasing renewable energy. Houston and Los Angeles, both in 2020, signed huge mega deals for generation of clean energy from solar and wind. And so these are ways that cities can help meet their needs. Or developing long-term sustainability plans, such as what Los Angeles did a few years ago, and many other cities have done as well. So there's a lot of ways, big picture here, there's a lot of ways that states and cities are helping lead the way on environmental policy making, particularly in the absence of federal government, meaningful federal government action on many environmental policy problems. The trick is that there's significant inconsistency to that. Many states are leading the way, but many states are not. Many states are just full out ignoring environmental problems. Many states are backtracking on previous commitments to address environmental problems. This is why environmental policymakers really would like to see things happen at the federal level because that ensures more consistent application across the country. And yet, in the absence of that, at least we have some states leading the way. And sometimes we see states using that laboratories of democracy approach, finding ways, experimenting with ways. Some work, some don't. But when different methods of addressing environmental policies do work, that provides models that other states can then copy, or ideally, that the federal government could copy and emulate. I don't know that that modeling has happened as effectively as we would like it to be, but certainly it has been better than the nothing that we sometimes see on the federal level. So I think it's probably fair to say that there's a mixed result on environmental policy making on the state level, but that certainly we have seen some positive benefits from that. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think environmental policy making at the state level is something that we should be excited about, or whether it's more of a shortcoming or a liability. All right, that's it for now. Thanks, everyone.